The custom chef jacket appeared before the speech did. It hung beneath a spotlight near the entrance, bright red against a wall of black branding panels, and Vanessa Ainsley noticed the alteration before anyone else. Her name had been stitched out. In its place, embroidered in fresh white thread, was Chloe Donovan. A few feet away stood William Kingsley in a charcoal suit, accepting congratulations as though the change were a routine business decision rather than a public execution of authorship. Then he stepped to the microphone and made it official. Chloe, dressed in an ivory chef coat she had never earned, would become the new executive chef of the flagship restaurant. Vanessa, he explained, no longer reflected the future image of the brand. Applause followed. Cameras turned. Vanessa looked at the jacket once more, then at the young woman wearing her replacement like a costume. And in that instant, she understood exactly what had happened. Not this time. She did not reach for the microphone. She did not defend herself. She simply turned and walked away before the room could enjoy a second act. By the time William returned to his investors, Vanessa was already moving through a private corridor toward the executive offices. Her heels crossed polished stone with steady precision. Every second mattered now. She entered the office that had once carried both their fingerprints and opened a locked drawer. Inside sat the red leather recipe notebook. The wax seal was untouched. So was the packet beneath it, containing months of intellectual property filings, registration confirmations, ownership records, and documented development histories for the signature sauces, reductions, marinades, and tasting menu foundations that had transformed a restaurant group into a culinary empire. She picked up the notebook. That was enough. Outside, guests were still celebrating a future they did not understand. Vanessa moved toward the private exit, carrying the only thing William had never truly possessed: creation. Inside the waiting vehicle, she opened the packet and reviewed every page. Dates, registrations, protected works, supporting documentation. The details were meticulous, because she had prepared for uncertainty long before she had prepared for betrayal. William had always believed success could be purchased, scaled, and packaged. Vanessa knew better. A restaurant survived because people returned for something they could not find elsewhere. She had built that reason herself. Her phone illuminated with incoming messages from industry contacts, journalists, and senior kitchen personnel. She ignored them all. First things first. She placed a call to a licensing officer and instructed immediate preservation of every protected record connected to the Kingsley operation. Then she authorized a full review of menu usage rights across all locations, serving recipes derived from her registered portfolio. The response was calm, professional, predictable. The process would begin immediately. Vanessa ended the call and looked through the window at the city moving around her. The humiliation no longer interested her. The applause no longer mattered. What mattered was that William had mistaken visibility for ownership. He believed removing her name would remove her contribution. He believed replacing a creator was the same as replacing a face. He had miscalculated. Vanessa closed the notebook and pressed her hand lightly against the red cover. The empire he had just celebrated was about to discover the difference between possessing a kitchen and possessing the mind that made it work. Then she made one final call. "Start the enforcement review," she said. Every recipe. Less than an hour after authorizing the enforcement review, Vanessa arrived at a private culinary development space she had maintained for years under a separate business entity. It was not glamorous. It was not designed for cameras. There were no investors waiting behind glass walls and no luxury branding displayed on every surface. There were stainless steel work tables, shelves lined with ingredients, temperature logs, testing journals, and the quiet order that serious craftsmanship demanded. For the first time that evening, she was alone. She placed the red leather notebook on a work table and removed her coat. Then her eyes settled on an item she had carried out of the restaurant without thinking. The red chef jacket. The one William had displayed like a trophy before replacing her. Vanessa lifted it carefully. The stitching where her name had been removed was rough, hurried, almost careless. Chloe Donovan's name sat where hers had once been, bright and visible, as if a few inches of thread could rewrite years of work. Vanessa ran her fingers across the altered fabric. The room remained silent. So did she. The pain arrived not as anger, but as clarity. That was the moment. Not the speech. Not the applause. Not even the humiliation. This. She realized that William had never truly seen her as a partner. A partner shares authorship. A partner protects contribution. A partner understands that success belongs to everyone who built it. William had looked at her talent and seen an asset, something transferable, something that could be reassigned once it became inconvenient. He had convinced himself that if her name disappeared, her value would disappear with it. Then she understood. The betrayal was deeper than replacement. He believed creation could be separated from the creator. Vanessa folded the jacket and placed it aside. No more illusions. Her attention returned to the things that still belonged to her. She opened the notebook. Inside were years of work, handwritten sauce ratios, flavor architecture diagrams, reduction schedules, protein treatment methods, notes from tasting sessions that had begun long before the Kingsley empire became fashionable. Every page represented a problem solved through discipline rather than publicity. William had owned dining rooms. Vanessa had built experiences. There was a difference. Her phone vibrated. Several messages had arrived from senior kitchen professionals, suppliers, and industry contacts. None of them mentioned William's speech. Instead, they asked the same question in different forms. What are you doing next? Vanessa noticed something important. Nobody was asking what William planned. Nobody was asking what Chloe planned. They were asking about her. Because expertise creates gravity. People follow the source. She began reviewing personnel records she had lawfully retained through her. Independent ventures, training histories, professional references, development notes, individuals she trusted, individuals who trusted her. A foundation still existed beneath the wreckage William thought he had created. He had removed her from a stage. He had not removed her from the profession. Vanessa closed the notebook and looked toward the test kitchen. Stainless steel reflected the overhead lights. Clean, precise, honest. The future would begin there. Not in a ballroom. Not behind a microphone. In the place where skill still mattered. She picked up her phone and sent a short message to a trusted industry contact. Reserve the space, she wrote. We start building tomorrow. The next morning began with paperwork rather than emotion. Vanessa arrived at the development kitchen before sunrise, placed the red leather notebook on the center work table, and opened a series of folders that most people would have found painfully uninteresting. Licensing records, registration certificates, development timelines, usage documentation. To Vanessa, they were not paperwork. They were infrastructure. For years, she had treated her culinary creations the way technology companies treated proprietary code. Every signature sauce, every tasting menu sequence, every reduction process, and every flavor system had been documented, time-stamped, and legally protected through carefully structured ownership filings. William had always laughed at the amount of documentation she maintained. He preferred headlines. Vanessa preferred proof. Now that difference mattered. Throughout the day, a licensing officer reviewed menu assets currently being served across Kingsley properties. A compliance specialist compared registered culinary materials against active restaurant offerings. A senior industry consultant examined supplier contracts linked to proprietary ingredients developed under Vanessa's direction. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. The work itself was enough. Every completed review created another layer of pressure William could not see yet. Then Vanessa built what she called a flavored dependency map. Not a menu. A map. Each Kingsley signature dish was broken down into sauce. Base, finishing acid, resting time, reduction temperature, supplier-specific ingredient, plating rhythm, and service sequence. The flagship menu did not depend on one recipe. It depended on a system only she had engineered. Then she moved to the second part of her strategy. People. Restaurants did not survive on recipes alone. They survived because trained professionals executed those recipes consistently. Vanessa spent hours reviewing development notes and performance histories from chefs, pastry specialists, and operations professionals she had mentored over the years. She was not recruiting anyone. Not yet. She was identifying where trust still existed. That distinction mattered. Loyalty built through fear vanished quickly. Loyalty built through respect remained available long after a contract ended. Meanwhile, across Manhattan, William embraced his new role as the public face of a supposedly transformed empire. Media interviews celebrated innovation. Lifestyle publications praised the restaurant's fresh direction. Chloe appeared in carefully staged photographs wearing an immaculate ivory chef coat. The visual narrative was working, at least on the surface. But a pattern emerged whenever journalists asked specific questions about culinary development. William redirected. He spoke about luxury experiences, market positioning, customer demographics, and brand evolution. When discussion drifted toward recipe creation or flavor architecture, he became noticeably impatient. He preferred ownership conversations. He avoided authorship conversations. That detail did not escape the people paying attention. During one interview, a food journalist asked which dish best represented the restaurant's new direction. William paused longer than expected before delivering a polished answer about guest experience and innovation. He never mentioned an ingredient. Not one. The article moved on. But the omission remained. Vanessa read the transcript later that evening. Then she closed the file. There it was again. The weakness beneath the confidence. William was not afraid of losing a building. He was not even afraid of losing money. What terrified him was a much smaller question. What if people stopped assuming he was responsible for the brilliance around him? What if they started asking who actually created the value? That fear had shaped every decision he made. Replacing Vanessa. Elevating Chloe. Controlling the narrative. Erasing authorship. It was never about progress. It was about concealment. Vanessa looked toward the notebook resting on the table. The red wax seal remained intact. So did the truth. Then she instructed the licensing officer to proceed to the next stage of review. The foundation was ready. You see, the first mistake a man like William makes is believing that a woman's silence is a signature on her own surrender. The second mistake is assuming that public humiliation changes private truth. It does not. The cruelest betrayals are rarely dramatic in the moment they happen. They often arrive dressed as reasonable business decisions. A title changes. A name disappears. A replacement is introduced with polished language and practiced smiles. The paperwork looks clean. The announcement sounds professional. Yet beneath that surface sits a far more dangerous message. Someone has decided that contribution and ownership are not the same thing. Someone has decided that creation can be separated from the creator. That was the lesson Vanessa finally accepted. William had not simply removed her from a position. He had attempted to relocate authorship itself. He wanted the prestige of her work without the inconvenience of acknowledging its source. But there is a flaw in every structure built on denial. Reality keeps records, and reality has remarkable patience. While the Kingsley organization invested its energy into maintaining appearances, Vanessa entered an entirely different season of her life. The development kitchen gradually transformed into something larger than a recovery space. It became a workshop for reinvention. Stainless steel tables filled with tasting notes. Ingredient samples arrived from trusted suppliers. Recipe journals expanded across multiple workstations. The atmosphere was focused, disciplined, and strangely optimistic. Nobody discussed revenge. They discussed execution. That difference mattered. Vanessa spent her mornings refining concepts she had postponed for years while building someone else's empire. New sauce structures, seasonal tasting sequences, ingredient pairings that traditional luxury restaurants considered too unconventional. Creative freedom returned one disciplined step at a time. Then the calls started arriving. Not from reporters, not from investors, from professionals. A pastry specialist requested a meeting. A culinary operations expert asked whether she was planning a future venture. A respected supplier quietly offered priority access to specialty ingredients. Vanessa never recruited anyone directly. She did not need to. People were making decisions on their own. Expertise attracts movement. Over the following weeks, a small but formidable circle formed around her. They gathered in the development space after long workdays. Some reviewed menu concepts. Others tested service systems. Others evaluated potential locations. No grand announcements were made. No press releases were issued. They simply worked. One evening, Vanessa stood before a tasting counter examining a new reduction she had spent days perfecting. The flavor was balanced, elegant, and unmistakably hers. For a moment, she remembered the woman who had once believed loyalty alone could protect contribution. That woman was gone now. Not destroyed. Refined. There was a difference. She picked up the red leather notebook and added a final notation beside the recipe. The handwriting remained steady. So did her purpose. Across the city, William was still investing enormous energy into convincing the world that nothing essential had changed. Vanessa no longer felt the need to challenge him publicly. Time would do that on its own. She had entered a new arena now. Not a ballroom. not a media stage, a place where talent, discipline, and memory still carried weight. And inside that room, her future was already beginning to take shape. For a while, it looked as if William Kingsley had won. The flagship restaurant remained open. Reservations still filled the dining room weeks in advance. Lifestyle magazines continued featuring glossy photographs of the redesigned brand. Investors smiled during private dinners. Chloe Donovan appeared on social media feeds wearing immaculate ivory chef coats, standing beneath carefully positioned lighting that suggested authority without ever proving it. From a distance, the transition seemed flawless. That illusion was exactly what William wanted. He moved through Manhattan's luxury hospitality circles with the confidence of a man who believed he had solved a problem. Vanessa had been removed. The narrative had been controlled. The future, according to every public statement, had arrived ahead of schedule. Yet beneath the polished surface, subtle cracks were beginning to form. They appeared first in conversations. During an investor luncheon, a guest praised a signature tasting course reduction that had become synonymous with the Kingsley brand. William accepted the compliment immediately. When asked how the concept had been developed, however, he redirected the discussion toward customer experience and business growth. The answer sounded sophisticated. It also avoided the question entirely. Few people noticed, but some did. Later that week, a respected food publication conducted a profile on Chloe's rise within the organization. In the weeks that followed, Chloe became increasingly visible across the brand's media channels. Short videos appeared from inside the flagship kitchen. She spoke confidently about refinement, elegance, and the future of luxury dining while standing beside dishes she had never developed. The audience responded well. The clips generated attention. Industry professionals watched them differently. They noticed that Chloe discussed presentation far more often than process. She described outcomes. She rarely described how those outcomes were achieved. The interviewer asked about the creative philosophy behind several dishes still featured prominently on the menu. Chloe answered in broad language about inspiration and innovation. Then she shifted the discussion toward branding initiatives and audience engagement. Once again, the specifics remained untouched. The article was published anyway. The photographs looked excellent. The substance felt strangely thin. William convinced himself none of it mattered. Public perception was the game, and public perception remained favorable. That belief became his comfort. It also became his blind spot. The truth was that William had spent years surrounding himself with people willing to celebrate outcomes without examining origins. He loved applause because applause rarely asked follow-up questions. Every compliment reinforced the image he had built around himself. Founder, visionary, architect. The titles sounded impressive. The problem was that he needed them more than he was willing to admit. One evening, during a private dinner attended by investors and hospitality executives, a guest casually referred to Vanessa as the culinary force who had transformed the company into an industry leader. The comment lasted only seconds. Most people moved on immediately. William did not. His expression hardened. His response arrived too quickly. He corrected the narrative with unusual intensity, emphasizing the strength of the organization rather than the contribution of any individual. The room became momentarily quiet. Then the conversation resumed. But the reaction lingered. Why had a simple acknowledgement unsettled him so much? Because the name still carried weight. Because he knew it carried weight. And because somewhere beneath the confidence, a fear continued growing. What if the industry eventually separated the empire from the person claiming credit for it? What if the public discovered that ownership and creation were not the same achievement? William pushed the thought away and raised a glass to future success. Around him, people smiled and returned the gesture. The evening appeared triumphant. Yet every celebration depended on a fragile assumption that the foundation beneath the brand would remain invisible forever. And foundations have a way of revealing themselves when someone tries too hard to take credit for the building above them. The first warning did not arrive as a public scandal. It arrived as paperwork. A licensing officer delivered formal notices regarding protected culinary assets connected to multiple signature dishes still being served throughout the Kingsley restaurant group. The language was precise, professional, and impossible to dismiss as emotion. Certain menu components were now under active ownership review. Certain recipes could no longer be assumed available for unrestricted commercial use. Certain culinary systems required immediate verification. William read the documents twice. Then a third time. He told himself it was manageable. After all, businesses handled compliance matters every day. His legal advisors would respond. The operations team would adapt. The restaurants would continue. That was the official position. Reality began moving in a different direction. Within days, executive chefs across the organization started receiving instructions to modify menu structures. Signature items that had anchored customer expectations for years suddenly became liabilities. Alternative versions appeared. Ingredient substitutions were introduced. Preparation methods changed. On paper, the differences looked minor. Guests noticed immediately. They always did. Fine dining customers rarely describe flavor scientifically, but they recognize authenticity when it disappears. Reservation feedback became more complicated. Repeat guests asked questions. Industry reviewers became curious. Something felt different. The comments remained polite. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Then the staffing problem emerged. Several highly respected kitchen professionals submitted resignations within a short period of time. None of them issued dramatic statements. None of them created public controversy. They simply left. Their departures created operational gaps that could not be filled through recruiting alone. Experience matters. Trust matters. Institutional memory matters. William had underestimated all three. Across the city, Vanessa continued working quietly inside her development kitchen. She did not celebrate the disruption. She focused on building. New concepts advanced. Potential locations were evaluated. Industry conversations expanded. Her attention remained fixed on the future. The system was correcting itself without requiring her presence. That was the point. Back inside the Kingsley organization, pressure continued building. Supplier relationships became more cautious. Certain specialty ingredients previously secured through long-standing trust now required additional negotiation. Some partnerships remained intact. Others became noticeably less flexible. Professional communities often behave this way. They rarely announce their conclusions. They simply adjust their level of cooperation. William began spending more time in operational meetings than public events. Questions multiplied. Solutions became less straightforward. The most uncomfortable development arrived through reputation rather than regulation. Food professionals started discussing authorship openly. Not accusations. Not gossip. Authorship. Industry publications revisited Vanessa's culinary achievements. Former interviews resurfaced. Archived profiles highlighting her role in recipe development circulated among hospitality circles. The conversation William had worked so hard to suppress was now happening without him. That was the real problem. He could manage legal reviews. He could hire consultants. He could redesign menus. But he could not control what people remembered. One afternoon, he entered a strategy meeting expecting reassurance. Instead, he found concern. The numbers were not catastrophic. Yet confidence had changed. Confidence is difficult to measure and impossible to replace quickly. William stared at the reports spread across the conference table. The empire still existed. The buildings still stood. The dining rooms remained beautiful. Yet for the first time, he sensed something moving beyond his reach. Not an attack. A shift. The system he believed he controlled was beginning to distinguish between the owner of a brand and the person who had given that brand its soul. And once that distinction appears, it becomes very difficult to erase. The moment William lost control did not begin in a courtroom or a boardroom. It began in a demonstration kitchen surrounded by cameras. Determined to restore confidence in the Kingsley brand, the company organized a high-profile live culinary event designed to showcase Chloe Donovan as the face of its future. The setting was elegant. The audience included hospitality investors, food journalists, luxury lifestyle media, and longtime patrons. Everything had been prepared to reinforce the same message William had been selling for months. The brand was evolving. The talent remained exceptional. Nothing essential had been lost. Then reality entered the room. Chloe stepped behind the workstation wearing a pristine ivory chef coat. The ingredients were arranged perfectly. The cameras were positioned perfectly. The script was perfect. The execution was not. Questions emerged almost immediately. A food journalist asked about the development logic behind a signature reduction previously associated with the restaurant's most celebrated tasting menu. Chloe offered a vague answer. Another question followed regarding flavor balance and preparation sequencing. Her explanation drifted toward branding language rather than culinary technique. The audience remained polite. The atmosphere changed anyway. Then came the most damaging moment. A request was made for a live preparation of one of the dishes that had helped establish the restaurant's reputation. Chloe hesitated. Only briefly, but long enough. People noticed. Experienced professionals always do. Without the support of the core culinary team that had quietly departed in recent weeks, the demonstration unraveled. Not dramatically, not publicly humiliating in a theatrical sense. Worse, it became obvious. The room began drawing its own conclusions. By the following morning, industry publications were no longer discussing innovation. They were discussing credibility. The question William had spent months avoiding was suddenly everywhere. If Vanessa created the food, then what exactly was William replacing? The damage spread quickly through professional circles. Investors became more cautious. Strategic partners delayed decisions. Reservation cancellations increased. At the next private tasting, the event coordinator greeted him politely, but walked past him to speak with the operations lead. A private banker returned his call with careful neutrality instead of warmth. One investor who used to clap him on the shoulder now checked his watch before the conversation had finished. The executive assistant no longer stood the moment he entered the room. Nobody insulted him. That was what made it worse. William began noticing small absences. A private investor who once sought him out at every event now offered only a brief greeting before continuing another conversation. A senior industry figure avoided discussing expansion plans. An executive assistant who had once anticipated every request now responded with polite efficiency instead of personal loyalty. Even routine interactions felt different. Respect had not vanished entirely. Certainly had. That distinction haunted him. Then Chloe started creating distance of her own. She still appeared beside him at scheduled events, but the confidence that had once defined her public presence began fading into caution. She had entered the arrangement expecting influence, admiration, and proximity to power. Now she was being associated with questions she could not answer. William recognized the shift immediately because it mirrored his deepest fear. The people around him had never been attached to difficulty. They had been attached to success, and success no longer felt guaranteed. The realization struck harder than any licensing notice. For years he had believed ownership alone created authority. Now he watched authority slowly separate itself from ownership. The empire still belonged to him, yet fewer people seemed impressed by that fact every day. Sitting alone in his office late one evening, William stared at a framed photograph from the restaurant's earliest years. Vanessa stood beside him in a red chef apron, holding a notebook against her chest. For the first time, he did not see a supporting figure. He saw the possibility he had spent years trying to bury. What if they were right? What if the brilliance people admired had never been his at all? And once that question entered his mind, it refused to leave. William Kingsley waited 3 days before contacting Vanessa directly. 3 days of worsening headlines. 3 days of difficult meetings. 3 days of watching confidence drain from rooms that once welcomed him effortlessly. By the time he requested a private meeting, the certainty that had defined him for years had become something thinner and far more fragile. Vanessa agreed to see him, not because she felt obligated, because she was finished avoiding the final conversation. They met inside her development kitchen late in the afternoon. The room carried none of the luxury signals William preferred. No investors, no media, no audience. Stainless steel work tables reflected the overhead lights. Shelves held ingredients and testing journals. The red leather notebook rested near the center of the room. William noticed it immediately. He also noticed something else. Vanessa looked entirely at home there. While his empire struggled to remember what it had once been, she appeared increasingly connected to what she was becoming. That realization unsettled him. He began carefully. He spoke about misunderstandings. He spoke about the pressure surrounding the company. He spoke about market conditions, brand stability, and the possibility of cooperation. Then he moved toward what he actually wanted. He asked her to help stabilize the situation. Licensing accommodations could be discussed. Certain disputes could be softened. Public messaging could be coordinated. The restaurant group needed time. The request sounded practical. Vanessa listened without interruption. When he finished, silence settled between them. Not hostile silence. Accurate silence. Finally she spoke. You don't need more time, William. Her voice remained calm. You need something you can no longer borrow. The words landed harder than accusation ever could. William looked away briefly before attempting another argument. He insisted that businesses evolve. Leaders make difficult decisions. Public perception matters. Vanessa recognized the pattern immediately. He was still trying to transform authorship into management language. Still trying to describe creation as administration. Still hiding behind structure. Then she opened the notebook. Page after page revealed years of documented work. Development records. Testing notes. Refinement histories. Evolution through discipline. Nothing dramatic. Just proof. Real proof. She turned the notebook toward him. Do you know what your mistake was? She asked. William said nothing. Vanessa answered anyway. You thought removing my name would make the work belong to you. She let the statement breathe for a moment before continuing. But ownership was never the problem. Creation was. There it was. The truth he had spent years outrunning. Not money. Not contracts. Not publicity. Creation. William's expression changed. For the first time, the confidence disappeared completely. Vanessa continued. You were never afraid I would leave. You were afraid people would discover they came for the food, not the building. You were afraid they would discover that talent cannot be transferred by announcement. Every sentence moved directly toward the wound he had hidden beneath ambition. William lowered his eyes to the notebook. He could not challenge the evidence. More importantly, he could not challenge the reality it represented. The empire still carried his name. Yet the thing that gave it meaning had never belonged to him. The room felt smaller now. Vanessa closed the notebook gently. No anger. No triumph. Just finality. Then she stood. You kept the buildings, she said. I kept the engine. That was enough. She picked up the red notebook and walked toward the door leading deeper into the kitchen. William remained where he was, surrounded by a profession he no longer understood and a truth he could no longer avoid. For the first time, there was nothing left for him to negotiate. True power is not having your name on the building. It is being the soul that the building cannot function without. There is a kind of betrayal that tries to confuse possession with creation. It says, because I own the walls, I own the work. Because I control the microphone, I control the truth. Because I can replace the face, I can replace the mind. But real mastery leaves fingerprints no announcement can erase. It lives in decisions made before anyone applauds. It lives in discipline repeated when no camera is present. William believed power meant being seen as the source. Vanessa learned that freedom meant no longer needing him to admit she had been the source all along. The most important thing she recovered was not a restaurant. It was authorship. He believed removing a woman's name from the work would eventually remove her from memory. But memory is not where true value lives. Value lives in skill. Value lives in discipline. Value lives in the ability to create something that continues attracting people long after the marketing campaign ends. That is why some empires survive scrutiny and others collapse beneath it. Vanessa learned a different lesson. She discovered that freedom does not begin when someone finally apologizes. Freedom begins when you stop requiring recognition from the person who refused to see your worth. What she recovered was the freedom to build under her own name. Months later, the opening of Ainsley's did not resemble the dramatic relaunches that had once defined the Kingsley brand. There were no oversized promises. No extravagant declarations about changing an industry. The focus remained where Vanessa always believed it belonged. On the work. The restaurant occupied a refined space designed around craftsmanship rather than spectacle. An open kitchen allowed guests to watch the culinary team operate with calm precision. The atmosphere carried confidence without needing to announce it. On opening week, reservations filled almost immediately. Then came the reviews. Leading food critics praised not only the food itself, but the clarity of vision behind it. They described a restaurant built by someone who understood every layer of the experience, from technique to service to storytelling. The praise felt different because it was attached directly to the source. One evening, Vanessa stood at the center of the dining room wearing a red silk blazer. Around her, guests celebrated anniversaries, business milestones, and ordinary evenings made memorable through exceptional food. Members of the team she trusted moved through the restaurant with purpose. Not because contracts demanded it, because they believed in what they were building together. Through the front windows, a line of waiting guests stretched along the block. Among them stood the same food critics who once treated the Kingsley name as an automatic invitation. Across the street, William's restaurant sat behind dark glass and a locked front door, its polished sign still expensive, still beautiful, and suddenly irrelevant. No one in the line turned to look at it. Vanessa did not either. She stood at the center of Ainsley's in her red silk blazer, opened the red leather notebook in her hands, and wrote one new line beneath the next menu draft. The room moved around her with precision. The future no longer belonged to the person who had tried to erase her. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.